Cop mocks blind black woman in court, collapses when her true identity is revealed. Rebecca's fingers brushed against the coarse surface of the brick wall as she walked alone, the steady tap of her cane guiding her through the dimly lit street. She had just left her physical therapy session, a necessary routine ever since the accident that stole her sight. There was a sudden silence, like the city holding its breath. Then it happened. Shattering glass, screams, footsteps pounding against the pavement, the unmistakable chaos of a crime in motion. A block ahead, three masked figures burst through the front entrance of a luxury jewelry store, their arms loaded with velvet trays, glinting with diamonds and gold. The alarm wailed in protest, piercing the night like a siren of panic. Pedestrians screamed and scattered in every direction. Car tires screeched. Doors slammed shut. Someone shouted, "Get down!" But Rebecca remained upright, motionless, frozen in a reality she couldn't see. She wasn't running. She wasn't ducking. She was simply there, unmoving, unknowing, a blind woman standing in the path of a city unraveling. As people bolted around her in frantic streams of fear, Rebecca stood near the wall, her hands still resting against the brick, her head tilted slightly, listening, trying to make sense of the sounds. Her heart pounded, confused by the chaos she couldn't interpret. She tightened her grip on her cane. Her instincts told her to stay still. Within minutes, the street exploded in flashing red and blue. Police cruisers skidded to a stop, sirens blaring like angry ghosts. Officers poured out, barking commands, weapons drawn. And that's when he saw her. Lieutenant Carter Jones, a man known for his gut instincts and an iron jaw, stepped out of his cruiser and scanned the chaos. People were ducked behind cars, cowering in storefronts. But amidst it all, one figure remained upright. One person wasn't running, wasn't hiding. Her, a black woman, standing alone, wearing dark glasses, holding a white cane. "Target acquired," his instincts whispered. Carter's hand moved to his holster as he approached. "Hey, you!" he barked, his voice slicing through the panic. "Hands where I can see them." Rebecca turned her head toward the voice, calm despite the noise. "Is something wrong, officer?" That answer, calm, controlled, too calm. Carter didn't like it. He stepped closer, boots heavy on the pavement. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "I'm walking home," Rebecca replied, her voice even, her fingers tightening slightly on the cane. "Walking home," he repeated, his tone laced with suspicion. "At this time of night? Alone?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. She'd been down this road before, the questions that weren't really questions, the tone that already held judgment. Carter's eyes narrowed. He glanced at the tote bag slung across her shoulder. "What's in the bag?" "My personal things," she said quietly. But Carter wasn't asking. He stepped forward and yanked it from her shoulder, rifling through it without permission. His fingers paused. A crisp $100 bill stared back at him. And that's all it took. His lips curled into a cold smirk. Well, look what we have here." Rebecca frowned, confused. "That's mine. My therapist gave it to me earlier for the cab." But he cut her off. "A robbery just went down, and you just happen to have fresh cash in your bag?" He lifted the bill like it was Exhibit A in a trial already decided. "Where are your accomplices?" he asked, stepping in closer. Rebecca's brows furrowed behind her dark glasses. "Accomplices? You were standing right outside the store when they ran out," Carter growled. "You didn't run. You didn't panic. You knew exactly what was going on." "I'm blind," she said softly. He didn't blink. "And I'm supposed to believe that's not an act?" The weight of his words slammed into her like a punch. She had no words, only the sting of injustice burning behind her ribs. A second officer approached. "No suspects in sight. They got away clean." Carter didn't miss a beat. He pointed at Rebecca. "Not all of them. But we don't have any evidence she was involved." The younger officer hesitated. Carter's voice dropped to a hard whisper. "She was here. She didn't run. And she's got unexplained cash. That's enough for probable cause." And just like that, Rebecca Lawson's world shifted. No witness, no weapon, no hard proof. Just a blind woman at the wrong place, at the wrong time, with skin the wrong color. "Turn around," Carter ordered. Rebecca stood frozen. "Please, I didn't..." The cold steel of handcuffs snapped shut around her wrists before she could finish. She inhaled sharply, her lips trembling not from fear, but fury. They didn't ask who she was. They didn't check her record. They didn't care. Because to them, she wasn't Rebecca Lawson. She wasn't a veteran. She wasn't a survivor. She was a silhouette, a statistic, a scapegoat. The last thing she heard before the squad car door slammed shut behind her was Carter's voice, low and smug. "We got her. Case closed." The moment the squad car pulled into the station lot, Rebecca could feel the weight of injustice press harder against her chest. Her wrists throbbed where the cuffs bit into her skin. She couldn't see the towering gray walls of the precinct, but she could hear the sharp slam of the metal doors, the echoing footsteps of officers pacing across tile, and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, a chorus of authority, indifferent and unforgiving. They didn't help her out of the car. They yanked her. Inside, no one said a word to her that wasn't a command. "Sit. Hands behind your back. Stay quiet." It wasn't a conversation. It was control. As they booked her fingerprints, personal items, mugshot, Rebecca tried to speak. "I don't understand what's happening. I didn't do anything." They didn't respond. They didn't even look at her. She was led down a hallway that reeked of bleach and stale air. The interrogation room was cold, metallic, and windowless. It felt like a box meant to crush people, not uncover truth. They sat her in a steel chair bolted to the ground. Her cane had been taken away. Without it, she was more disoriented than ever, trapped in an invisible world, surrounded by people who had already decided she was guilty. No lawyer, no phone call, no rights read aloud, just silence and then accusation. Lieutenant Carter Jones stepped in first, his presence like a shadow spreading across the room. He tossed a manila folder on the table with a thud that made Rebecca flinch. He didn't sit. He loomed. His voice was calm, cold, rehearsed. "You know why you're here." "I don't," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't see anything. I didn't know what was happening." "Exactly," he said, stepping closer. "You didn't see, but you knew." He opened the folder and pulled out a photo. She couldn't see it, of course, but he described it in detail. "Here," he said, tapping the image with his finger, "is you, standing outside the store. Right here, your hand is raised." "I was using the wall to navigate," she said quietly. "You expect me to believe that?" he snapped. "You just happened to raise your hand as 3 masked robbers ran out the door?" "I'm blind," she whispered. "I didn't even know." "And that's convenient," he cut in. "Too convenient." Another officer stepped in, a younger man, clearly less certain, but still playing along. He held up a bag with Rebecca's belongings. "We found the cash." "Therapy payment," she said. "My instructor gave it to me. You can call." "No one's calling anyone," Carter said sharply. "You don't get to control this room." Then came the so-called witness. They didn't bring him in, but they referenced him, some man who'd apparently seen everything from across the street. Carter opened a statement, began to read. "He says he saw you raise your hand right before the robbers escaped. Says you were clearly signaling them, helping them time their getaway." "I didn't see anyone," Rebecca exclaimed. "I didn't hear them until it was too late. I was just trying to figure out where I was." "You're lying," Carter said flatly. The words hit her like bricks. She felt the chill of the room creeping into her skin, through her bones. She sat straight, composed, but inside, she was unraveling. Not because she was guilty, but because she realized this wasn't about the truth. It never was. This was about making someone fit a story, and she was perfect for it. A solitary woman, poor, disabled, black. Easy to blame, easy to bury. The officers circled her with accusations, each one sharper than the last. "Why were you there? Why didn't you run? Why didn't you call for help?" The questions weren't seeking answers. They were digging a grave. Rebecca kept her voice calm, steady, but her hands trembled in her lap. "I told you, I was on my way home. I walk this route every Wednesday," Carter scoffed. "And you just happened to stop right in front of a high-end jewelry store during a major robbery? You expect anyone to buy that?" "I can't choose where crime happens," she said, more to herself than them. Carter slammed his palm down on the table. the sound cracking through the room. "Stop lying! I'm not lying!" she shouted back, tears burning behind her eyes. "I couldn't even see what was happening." "You don't have to see to be involved," he growled. "You were the lookout. You gave the signal. They ran. You stayed. Classic setup." She shook her head. "I don't know them. I don't know anything about any of this." "You were at the scene," he snapped. "That's all I need." "But you have no proof," she cried out. "We have fingerprints. We have testimony. We have motive," Carter hissed. "That's enough for the DA." And there it was. The reality dropped like a guillotine. They weren't interested in solving a crime. They were interested in closing a case, and she was convenient. Rebecca felt her pulse in her throat. She sat there, hands clenched, the room spinning despite the stillness. She wasn't being treated as a person, she was being processed like evidence. Dehumanized, reduced. No one listened. No one believed. No one cared. She thought of the years she spent proving her worth in silence, the jobs she worked, the therapies she endured, the independence she fought for. All of it erased in an instant, by one accusation, because she couldn't see, because she was poor, because her skin was dark. The officer read her rights like it was a formality, a checklist. You have the right to remain silent. But she wasn't silent, not inside. Inside, something was screaming for justice, for dignity, for breath. They slid a confession across the table. "If you cooperate," Carter said, "you might get a deal. Otherwise, you're going down with the rest of them." Rebecca didn't move. She didn't reach for the pen. This was a setup, a lie dressed as a legal process. And she knew it. But what choice did she have? She sat in that freezing room, surrounded by strangers who saw her not as a woman, but as a problem to be solved. And for the first time since losing her sight, Rebecca Lawson felt truly invisible. But the nightmare didn't end at the police station, it only deepened. After the interrogation, after the baseless accusations and the cold silence, Rebecca was dragged into a holding cell where the walls were just as unforgiving as the people who put her there. What awaited her inside wasn't just isolation, it was humiliation, cruelty, and the slow, suffocating weight of being dehumanized. The cell was ice cold, not from the temperature, but from the absence of humanity. Concrete walls closed in like a tomb, stained with the ghosts of forgotten stories. A single flickering bulb buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow light across the floor. The cot beneath Rebecca was thin, the mattress barely a cushion against the metal frame. Every breath she took came out in wisps, shallow and uncertain. She was a blind woman locked in a system that had already decided she didn't matter. The door slammed shut behind her with a clang that echoed too long, too final. No one said when she'd get a lawyer. No one said when she'd get her call. She was just shelved, like a misplaced file. Across the cell block, murmurs began. The prisoners were already talking. "She's the one," someone whispered from behind the bars across the corridor. "The chick that acted blind to cover for her crew." "Blind?" A woman scoffed, voice sharp like broken glass. "Please, that's the oldest con in the book." Another voice laughed, louder this time. "Bet she can see better than me. She's just trying to get sympathy." The words pierced the air like shrapnel. "She was part of that jewelry job, right? What's she doing in Gen Pop? Shouldn't she be in some hospital wing?" "Guess the cops finally stopped babying her. About time someone called her out." Rebecca sat still, head bowed, fists clenched in her lap. But she heard everything. Every cruel word. Every bite of doubt. And then came the worst of it from the guards. One of them chuckled as he passed her cell. "Guess that whole blind act didn't work on the judge, huh?" Another leaned against the bars. "So what is it, sweetheart? You memorized the sidewalk patterns? Or got some James Bond earpiece telling you where to walk?" Laughter echoed behind him like a sickening chorus. Rebecca didn't answer. She didn't flinch. She just reached into the inside pocket of her worn oversized coat. Her fingers searched with quiet desperation until they found it. A small, smooth object. Cold metal. Familiar. The pendant. She closed her fingers around it and held it tight to her chest. It was the only piece of herself they hadn't taken. A simple chain. On it, a round medallion. slightly scuffed from years of wear. But the words engraved on it remained as sharp as the day she'd earned it. Serve with honor. It wasn't just a motto, it was a memory. And as she sat alone in that freezing cell, mocked and misunderstood, the past surged forward. Years before she found herself trapped inside a jail cell, Rebecca Lawson was on the front lines of a different kind of battlefield, one where silence meant death, and one wrong keystroke could mean the loss of a city block. She had been a U.S. Army cyber operations specialist, handpicked from a sea of applicants for her brilliance in systems encryption and digital counterterrorism. While others carried rifles, Rebecca carried lines of code that could intercept satellite detonators, disable weapons grids, or shut down a drone fleet in seconds. She was invisible then too, not because she couldn't be seen, but because few understood the depth of her value. But it all changed one night in northern Iraq. She'd been stationed at a joint base near the edge of a volatile conflict zone. Her team had intercepted a coded transmission brief, fragmented, but enough to indicate something big. A series of bombs had been planted in a civilian village, triggered by a remote frequency pulsing through the communications tower nearby. The Army sent out ground teams to evacuate the area, but without cutting the signal, the explosives could be detonated at any moment. And so, while others rushed out, Rebecca went in alone, into the signal hub, a crumbling building rigged to blow if tampered with. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the sharp stench of oil. The walls were covered in wires, some live, some dummy. At the center was a control panel, humming with lethal intent. Her job wasn't to cut the wires, it was to hijack the command stream, override the detonation logic, and reroute the failsafe. It was like defusing a bomb made of invisible code. The countdown had already started. 20 minutes. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, sweat dripping down her spine, her headset buzzing with updates from outside. Civilians en route. 4 minutes away. You've got 10 minutes max. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. Every second mattered. And then 9 minutes left, she found it. The signal trigger, embedded beneath 5 layers of encryption, disguised as a diagnostic ping. She rewrote, but the system fought back. 7 minutes. Her screen flickered. Static filled her earpiece. And then it happened. An unexpected override command manual, local. Someone had activated a physical failsafe inside the room. A trap. The blast hit before she could react. Not a full explosion, but a directed shockwave. Heat, pressure. The sound of her eardrums bursting, screen shattered, metal sheared open. She remembered falling backward. She remembered light blinding, searing, and then nothing. Silence. Darkness. She woke up 3 days later in a military hospital in Ramstein, Germany. Eyes bandaged, ears still ringing. She was told the truth in sterile, emotionless language. The explosion damaged both optic nerves. We're sorry, Agent Lawson. The sight loss is permanent. No medals, no applause, no ceremony, just a clipboard, a medical discharge, and a plane ticket back to a country that didn't even know what she had done. The family she saved never knew her name. Neither did the soldiers who lived because of her delay command that froze the bomb relay. She returned home quietly, fading into civilian life like a ghost no one ever saw. And that was how she wanted it. Rebecca never told anyone, not about the mission, not about the injury. She wore her blindness without complaint, never asking for pity. She refused to be defined by what she lost, because what she gained was purpose, and sacrifice was the price. She found work where she could, learn new skills, learn to navigate a world built without her in mind. She built a life, piece by piece, in a society that never looked twice at women like her. But now they looked and they saw only what they wanted. In that holding cell surrounded by cement and stairs, no one saw a veteran. No one saw a war hero. They saw an easy target. A blind woman with no witnesses, no support, no voice. Because she had chosen silence, because she had buried her past to avoid pity, they buried her in presumption. Now her quiet dignity was twisted into guilt. Her blindness became a disguise. Her calm became suspicion. Why didn't she run? Why was she so calm? She must have known something. She could almost hear their inner voices. The police, the press, the public. No one asked, why would a disabled black woman risk everything for a few dollars and a fake signal? They didn't ask because they didn't care. Rebecca understood now with sickening clarity that the silence she had chosen to protect herself was the very thing they used to destroy her. The longer she stayed silent, the stronger their narrative became. But she wasn't silent because she was guilty. She was silent because they didn't deserve her story. They didn't deserve to know what it felt like to crawl through smoke-filled concrete, blood dripping into your mouth as you rewired a live detonator. They didn't deserve to hear about the moment she chose to stay inside that signal hub when she could have run because a family was 3 minutes from the blast zone. They didn't deserve the weight of her truth. But maybe, just maybe, it was time they heard it anyway, because if silence was going to be her enemy, then truth might be her only weapon left. As the days blurred together in the cold, lifeless cell, Rebecca knew one thing with undeniable certainty: this wasn't the end. The trial was coming, and when it did, the world would see her not as she was, but as they wanted her to be. But no one would listen to the truth. No one would ask the right questions. They had already decided, and soon it would be her turn to face the courtroom, where the weight of their assumptions would crush her without a chance to fight back. The courtroom was suffocating, not because of the air, though it was stale and too still, but because of the way every eye was locked on Rebecca Lawson, like she'd already been sentenced. The jury stiff in their seats, the spectators leaning forward with hushed anticipation. Even the judge looked like he'd seen this show before. To them, this wasn't a trial, it was a performance, and she had been cast as the villain. Rebecca sat at the defense table in silence. Her back was straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the corners of her lips pressed into a firm, unreadable line. Her dark glasses masked the exhaustion in her eyes, but her body told the story, shoulders rigid, muscles locked in tension. She didn't flinch when the bailiff called the room to order. She didn't react when the judge announced the charges. She'd already heard the verdict in their minds. Now they were just going through the motions. The prosecutor was a tall, polished man with silver at his temples and a voice that carried like a war drum. Every movement was deliberate, every word calculated. He strode to the center of the room, holding a remote like a dagger. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case is not about speculation. It's about facts." He pressed a button. A grainy, still image filled the screen behind him. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly, giving the projection center stage. "This," he continued, "is the defendant Rebecca Lawson captured by a security camera outside Jefferson and Lane Jewelry, moments before the robbery occurred." Murmurs rippled through the room. Rebecca couldn't see the image, but she knew what it showed. She'd been told. A blurry figure, hand raised slightly, head tilted as though listening. A still moment frozen in time interpreted however they pleased. The prosecutor turned back toward the jury, his tone tightening. "You'll notice her hand lifted just before the masked perpetrators ran from the store. You'll see that she was not panicked, not confused, not even moving. She was waiting." He paused, letting the silence fill with suspicion. Rebecca sat still, motionless. He clicked again. A close-up of a fingerprint appeared, then another slide, a digital report. "This," he said, "is the defendant's fingerprint recovered from the store's main entrance." Another wave of murmurs. "And that," the prosecutor concluded, voice deepening, "is how we know she was not simply a passerby. She made contact with the store. She was part of this." The implication hung in the air like a noose. He let it sit. Then came the final blow. The prosecutor motioned to the back. "The prosecution calls its first witness." A man stepped forward, nervous but rehearsed. He took the stand, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore in with a shaky voice. He was average-looking, forgettable, but today he was the government's star player. "I saw her," he said, nodding solemnly. "She was standing there near the front of the store. She wasn't moving." The prosecutor leaned in. "Did she do anything suspicious?" A pause. The man hesitated, then committed. "She raised her hand, just as the robbers came out, like she was signaling." The words were vague, thin, but they were deadly. Rebecca clenched her jaw. No one asked where the man had been standing, how far, what his history was. No one questioned the certainty of his claim. because they didn't need to. They had their story. And no one mentioned that the woman in that photo was blind. Not once. Not when the image was shown. Not when the fingerprint was displayed. Not when the signal was described. Her condition was not an oversight, it was a strategy. Because if they acknowledged she was blind, the illusion collapsed. So they left it out. And her court-appointed lawyer? A middle-aged man with tired eyes and a stack of unrelated case files. He leaned back in his chair, said little, objected even less. When it was his turn to speak, he cleared his throat and mumbled about reasonable doubt, like he'd already lost. He didn't ask for camera footage from different angles. He didn't press the witness on details. He didn't even bring up her disability. Rebecca was a defendant without a voice, and no one cared to give her one. Every glance in the room, every sideways whisper carried the same unspoken question. Why didn't she run? The assumption had been made. The verdict quietly settled. They looked at her like she was the mastermind, like she'd orchestrated the heist and was now playing helpless to escape consequence. Like blindness was a tool, not a truth. Rebecca didn't fight to speak. She didn't plead, because she'd learned long ago that when people made up their minds, words were just noise. She sat in that courtroom not as a person, but as a projection of their prejudice. They didn't see her medals. They didn't see the service record, the injuries, the sacrifices. They saw the color of her skin. As the final words of the prosecutor echoed in her ears, Rebecca realized the truth. No one would listen to her now. Her fight in the courtroom had been in vain. The verdict was delivered and her future was sealed. The gavel fell with a finality that echoed through Rebecca's bones. Guilty, the judge had declared, and the words were like a weight that crushed her chest, suffocating any hope she had left. The room was still, the murmur of the crowd nothing more than a dull buzz in her ears. Her lawyer hadn't put up much of a fight. His arguments had been weak, his questions irrelevant. The prosecution had presented nothing more than flimsy evidence, grainy photos, a fingerprint, and a so-called witness who could barely recall the details. But it didn't matter. They had already made up their minds about her. Rebecca felt the cold metal cuffs snap around her wrists again as the bailiff motioned for her to rise. She glanced at the jury, their faces all turned away, unwilling to meet her gaze. No one saw her as an innocent woman caught in a terrible misunderstanding. They saw only a black, blind woman with a convenient story, a convenient suspect to pin the crime on. Her heart sank as the courtroom doors opened, and she was led out in front of the reporters, flashing cameras and whispers that burned like acid. The weight of their judgment, the pressure of their assumptions, was unbearable. She was nothing more than a criminal in their eyes. Rebecca was sentenced to 5 years in prison for her supposed role in the robbery, though she hadn't been anywhere near the scene of the crime, and the real perpetrators were still at large. 5 years. The thought of it was almost too much to bear. She had come so close to proving her innocence. But in that moment, it felt as though the world had turned its back on her forever. As they led her back to the holding cells, she fought to hold herself together. She wouldn't cry. Not now, not in front of these people who had already decided she was guilty. But inside, a storm raged. Back in the cold, empty cell, Rebecca collapsed onto the cot. The weight of the past weeks, of the trial, of everything she had lost, settled around her like a suffocating blanket. The walls felt smaller now, the air heavier. She could still hear the echoes of the courtroom, the whispered judgments, the mocking glances. She reached for the pendant around her neck, its smooth surface grounding her for just a moment. Serve with honor. Honor. Where was the honor in any of this? She had given everything for a cause she believed in. She had saved lives, sacrificed her sight, and now she was being punished for a crime she didn't commit. The silence of the cell was deafening, but it gave her the space to think. For the first time, Rebecca felt truly alone. Her blindness, which had once been a barrier to others, now felt like a trap. She couldn't even see the faces of those who were condemning her. She couldn't see the world as it was, but she knew one thing for certain. She was not going to let this be the end. But how? How could she fight back against an entire system that had already written her off as guilty? The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. The fluorescent lights of the prison visitation room flickered overhead, humming with a dull, oppressive rhythm. Rebecca Lawson sat alone at the far end of the plastic table, her wrists resting on the cold surface, her posture stiff but composed. The orange jumpsuit she wore clung to her like a badge of humiliation, not guilt. Around her guards stood like statues, watching every movement, every breath. This wasn't a place where people found justice. It was where justice was left to rot. Then the door opened. A young woman stepped in, dressed in a simple gray blazer and black slacks. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the room with focus and urgency. She moved quickly, confidently, and when she sat down across from Rebecca, it was clear she didn't come to ask for trust. She came to earn it. "My name is Maya Ellis," she said calmly. "I'm an attorney." Rebecca's expression didn't change. Her lips were tight, her eyes hidden behind dark glasses, her face unreadable. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She had seen too many people who claimed they wanted to help. Maya reached into her bag and placed a thin folder on the table. "I've been reviewing your case. I came across it by accident. But what I read, it doesn't sit right. None of it." Rebecca tilted her head slightly. "They already decided. A judge, a jury. What does it matter now?" "It matters," Maya said, her voice firm, "because I think you're innocent. And if I'm right, then someone set you up." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then Rebecca spoke, her voice quiet but sharp. "And what do you expect me to do? Cry? Beg? I've been locked in this cell for months for something I didn't do. I've already tried believing people. I believed justice existed. That didn't go well." Maya leaned forward, her voice unwavering. "I don't want your belief. I want your permission to fight." Rebecca's hand twitched slightly, the only sign of emotion she allowed. "Fine. Do what you want, but don't expect me to hope." That was all Maya needed. Back in her office, Maya launched herself into the case like a woman possessed. The file was a disaster, thin arguments, vague connections, and a clear narrative driven more by prejudice than fact. The prosecution had relied on a single camera still, a shaky witness statement, and a rogue fingerprint. There were no weapons, no stolen goods, no real motive. So why had Rebecca been convicted so quickly? Maya started with the witness, the man who had testified that he saw Rebecca raise her hand to signal the robbers, Peter Fisher. She tracked down his records and immediately found a red flag. He had a criminal past. Multiple arrests for fraud, theft, and public intoxication. Charges that had mysteriously disappeared just weeks before the trial. Digging deeper, Maya found financial records. A bank deposit $2,000 dated 3 days before Fisher took the stand. The money had come from an untraceable source, but Maya had a hunch. She followed the trail, and it led her straight to Lieutenant Carter Reynolds, the officer who had arrested Rebecca, the same man who had built the case, the same man who had claimed Rebecca was too calm and acting suspicious, the same man who had conveniently found a fresh $100 bill in her bag. Next, Maya focused on that money, the so-called proof that Rebecca had benefited from the crime. She obtained the list of serial numbers from the stolen cash. It took days of bureaucracy and paperwork, but when she finally got access, her jaw dropped. The serial number on the bill found in Rebecca's bag didn't match any of the stolen bills, not even close. That was the second lie. The prosecution had built their case on half-truths and assumptions, and no one had bothered to check. Or worse, they had known and ignored it. Maya's final task was to find out if there was more footage angles, evidence the court never saw. And there was. She filed a motion to access private security footage from the building across the street from Jefferson and Lane Jewelry. After multiple denials and legal pressure, the building management finally released a hard drive from the night of the robbery. Maya loaded the footage and watched and froze. There was Rebecca, standing still, alone, facing slightly toward the commotion but making no movement. No hand signal. No strange gestures. Nothing. Her hand moved up once, but not in any kind of signal. She was feeling the brick wall beside her, stabilizing, orienting herself, a blind woman using touch to find her bearings in a moment of chaos. Maya watched it again and again. This was the footage that could have saved Rebecca. But it had never been shown, never submitted, never even mentioned. Whether by negligence or design, it had been buried. And now Maya had it. She returned to the prison, this time not with questions but with answers. Rebecca sat across from her again, her posture the same. But something in her shifted when Maya began to speak. "I have proof," Maya said. "I found the real footage. I know the witness lied. I know the money in your bag wasn't from the robbery." Rebecca said nothing at first. Her lips parted, then closed again. And then finally, quietly, "You really found it?" Maya nodded. "They silenced you because it was easy, because no one thought you'd fight back. But now you will, with me." Rebecca's hand moved slowly to her chest, where the old pendant rested beneath the jumpsuit. Her fingers curled around it. "Serve with honor," she whispered. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe. For the first time in months, Rebecca was no longer just a silent figure behind bars. She was a voice with proof. Armed with new evidence and a lawyer who refused to back down, she was led back into the courtroom. Chi Viet Bang Ting on ChatGPT said, "Toi an Jok Chat Kin Jen Tuong." Journalists with notepads at the ready, courtroom sketch artists furiously scribbling, a gallery full of strangers leaning forward in tense anticipation. And at the center of it all, Rebecca Lawson, seated silently at the defense table, her head held high, her dark glasses hiding the storm brewing just beneath the surface. For months, she had been painted as a criminal, a liar, a fraud. For months, the prosecution's narrative had gone unchallenged. But today, everything was about to change. Maya Ellis stood with calm precision beside the defense table. Her suit was pressed, her expression sharp, her voice steady as steel. She had waited for this moment. She had clawed for it through bureaucracy, resistance, and silence. Now she had the truth, and it was about to be unleashed. "Your Honor," she said, turning to face the judge, "the defense respectfully submits new video evidence previously omitted from discovery that contradicts the prosecution's central claim." The judge peered over his glasses, eyes narrowing. "Proceed." The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the room. Maya stepped to the monitor, remote in hand. "This footage," she said clearly, "was obtained from a private security camera mounted on the building across the street from the alleged crime scene. Unlike the grainy and partial images presented earlier, this video provides a full, unobstructed angle of the defendant's actions before, during, and after the robbery." The screen came to life, and there she was, Rebecca, alone, blind, vulnerable. The image was clearer than anything the jury had seen before. It showed Rebecca standing on the sidewalk, her hand brushing the wall beside her as she slowly oriented herself. The commotion inside the jewelry store had already begun. Alarms blared in the background. Pedestrians ran. Lights flashed. But Rebecca did not run. She did not move to help. She did not even look toward the chaos because she couldn't. The jury watched in silence as Rebecca's hand moved slightly, not upward, not outward, not in any deliberate gesture, but along the bricks of the building, a blind woman using her sense of touch to anchor herself amidst panic. "She's not signaling," Maya said, voice low but firm. "She's navigating." The video continued. One of the robbers rushed out of the store, dashing past her. Rebecca flinched at the sound, stepping back. Her hands pulled in tight to her chest, the universal posture of someone startled, not someone complicit. The video froze. Maya turned back to the court. This is the same moment the prosecution used to claim Ms. Lawson was signaling the robbers to escape. The same moment that led to her arrest. The difference is, now we see what actually happened. She let the silence hang. Then she continued. "The defense also submits this document," she said, handing a page to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge and jury. "An official report from the Federal Reserve, listing the serial numbers of the bills stolen from Jefferson and Lane jewelry the night of the robbery." She walked to the evidence table, lifted a sealed plastic bag, and held it up. Inside was the infamous $100 bill, the so-called proof that had tied Rebecca to the crime from the beginning. "This is the bill found in my client's purse," Maya said, voice rising just slightly, enough to draw the full attention of the room. Now compare the serial number on this bill to the stolen ones. You'll find it doesn't match. In fact, she held up another sheet. You'll find that it was issued weeks before the robbery ever took place. It has no connection to the crime scene whatsoever. Gasps rippled through the gallery. One juror leaned forward, another whispered to their neighbor. Maya stepped closer to the jury box, her eyes scanning each face. What we've seen today is not just a misunderstanding. It's a misrepresentation of evidence, of character, of truth. She paused, then continued with the precision of a scalpel. Rebecca Lawson was arrested not because of what she did, but because of what they thought she looked like. Because she didn't run. Because she didn't scream. Because she couldn't see. And in their eyes, that made her suspicious. She took a step back, her voice colder now, cutting through the silence like a blade. The prosecution built their case on a photo, a gesture misread, a dollar bill that didn't belong, and a witness who we now know had a criminal record and accepted money from the arresting officer. All eyes turned toward the prosecution table. The lead prosecutor, once confident and composed, now shuffled through his papers, his face pale, his composure cracking. Lieutenant Carter Reynolds, seated in the gallery behind him, shifted in his seat, his jaw clenched tight. Maya wasn't finished. This woman, she motioned to Rebecca, served her country. She sacrificed her sight to save lives, and for that she was discarded, labeled, imprisoned without evidence, without justice. She turned to the judge. We ask that the court acknowledge this miscarriage of justice and immediately move to vacate Ms. Lawson's conviction. Silence followed, but it wasn't the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of a courtroom that had just watched its own narrative collapse. The judge leaned back in his chair, visibly shaken. The jurors whispered among themselves, the weight of what they'd seen shifting the entire mood of the room. For months, they had believed Rebecca was guilty. Now they couldn't look her in the face. The courtroom lights seemed harsher now, silence heavier. The air itself felt charged as if it was waiting to crack. All eyes were on Maya Ellis as she approached the witness stand, her heels striking the polished floor with a rhythm that echoed like a countdown. At the center of the storm sat Peter Fisher, the prosecution's star witness. Nervous, fidgeting, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. He didn't look like the confident man who once testified that he had clearly seen Rebecca signal the robbers. He looked like a man who knew the walls were closing in. Maya stopped just a foot away from him, the thin folder in her hands now thick with truth. Her voice was calm, but every word landed like a hammer. Mr. Fisher, do you recall the statement you gave under oath regarding Ms. Lawson's actions on the night of the robbery? Fisher swallowed hard. Yes, I do. You said you saw her raise her hand like she was giving a signal, correct? Yes, that's what I said. Maya nodded, flipping open the folder. I find that interesting, she said, because we now have surveillance footage from a camera across the street that shows Ms. Lawson was doing no such thing. In fact, the footage makes it clear she was using her hand to feel along the wall, a blind woman attempting to navigate unfamiliar terrain. Fisher shifted in his seat. I didn't see the footage. I remember what I saw. Do you? Maya asked, her voice dropping slightly, sharpening. Or do you remember what you were told to say? The courtroom tensed. A low murmur buzzed at the edge of the gallery. The judge leaned forward. So did the jury. Maya reached into her folder again. Mr. Fisher, are you aware that we obtained your financial records? Fisher went pale. 3 days before your testimony, a sum of $2,000 was deposited into your bank account from a private account traced back to Lieutenant Carter Reynolds. Do you deny receiving that money? That was personal. Maya cut him off. And are you aware that you were cited for public intoxication and disorderly conduct just weeks before your statement? Charges that mysteriously disappeared after you agreed to testify? Peter Fisher's mouth opened, but no words came out. The courtroom was deadly quiet. Maya didn't stop. Mr. Fisher, did Lieutenant Reynolds instruct you on what to say in your testimony? His voice cracked. I didn't want any trouble. That's not an answer. Peter Fisher looked down, his voice barely a whisper. Yes. Gasps erupted around the room. The judge slammed his gavel once. Order! But it was too late. The damage had been done. Maya turned slowly toward the gallery, then toward the prosecution table, where Lieutenant Carter Reynolds sat frozen, his face pale, fists clenched at his sides. Maya stepped closer to the center of the courtroom, letting the silence draw out before speaking. Let the record show that the state's key witness admitted to perjury and that his testimony was influenced, if not fully orchestrated, by the arresting officer. She turned, her voice rising, stronger, fiercer. This isn't just a case of mistaken identity. This is a fabricated narrative, built on lies, corruption, and intimidation. And at the center of it is the man who claimed he was simply doing his job. She pointed unapologetically at Carter Reynolds. This man manufactured evidence. He bribed a witness. He buried key footage. He profiled and persecuted an innocent woman simply because she didn't fit his idea of what innocence looks like. Reynolds' face was red now, fury and fear battling in his eyes. He opened his mouth, but the judge stopped him with a single glare. Lieutenant Reynolds, you are not permitted to speak unless called to the stand. The courtroom was completely still. It was the kind of silence that doesn't beg for noise, it demands reflection. And in that silence, for the first time, Rebecca was no longer invisible. She sat at the defense table, head held high, expression unreadable. But her hands, usually folded, composed, now gripped the edge of the table, trembling with something unfamiliar. Recognition, vindication, and rage. Because now the truth was no longer buried. It was out in the open, for the world to see. The same system that had turned a blind eye to her suffering was now being forced to confront its own rot. The judge leaned back in his seat, visibly shaken. Counsel, do you have further evidence? Maya nodded. Yes, Your Honor. But what we've just heard speaks louder than anything I could say. She turned to the jury. Rebecca Lawson is not guilty. She never was. And now you know why she ended up here, not because she committed a crime, but because someone needed her to be guilty. Because it was easier, cleaner, simpler. She paused, letting the gravity of the words settle in. But justice, she said, voice cracking slightly from the emotion rising in her throat, is never simple. It requires the courage to admit when we've been wrong. It requires us to listen. And for the first time, they were listening. The jurors sat in stunned silence. The prosecution looked defeated. Carter Reynolds sat motionless, his world collapsing around him. And Rebecca Lawson, after everything they had taken from her, her sight, her name, her freedom, finally had what they couldn't take. The truth, in a room that finally heard her. The courtroom was still trembling from the last blow Maya had landed, the unraveling of Lieutenant Carter's lies, the collapse of the prosecution's carefully orchestrated illusion. But what came next would silence the room completely. Maya Ellis stood at the center of the courtroom like a conductor before the final movement. She was holding a thick envelope unmarked, sealed in red. The bailiff approached, eyeing it warily. Maya handed it to him with a nod. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to introduce one final piece of evidence. The judge, clearly unsettled by the revelations that had already shaken the foundation of the case, adjusted his glasses. Is this classified? Maya nodded. It was, until this morning. We've obtained clearance. She turned to the jury, then to the gallery. Her voice dropped low, steady, deliberate. Before Rebecca Lawson was a defendant, before she was arrested, before she was accused, humiliated, and buried beneath a system that didn't care to ask who she really was, she served. The courtroom didn't breathe. Maya walked to the projection screen. I'm about to show you something the prosecution never bothered to discover. Something the world forgot, or maybe never knew. The screen flickered to life. A photograph appeared. Rebecca, in uniform, her face younger, her posture straight, standing tall, saluting on a tarmac under a blazing sun. Behind her, a row of soldiers. In front of her, the President of the United States, reaching out to pin a gleaming medal on her chest. The Presidential Medal of Valor? Gasps echoed like thunder. The gallery burst into murmurs. Reporters scrambled for their cameras. Flash after flash illuminated Rebecca's face, though she didn't react. She sat perfectly still. The photo faded. Another appeared. A classified military commendation letter, stamped and sealed. Maya read aloud. Specialist Rebecca Lawson displayed extraordinary courage during a counterinsurgency operation near Fallujah. Upon discovering a remote-triggered explosive device near a civilian shelter, Specialist Lawson bypassed protocol, disabled the device manually, and shielded the blast with her own body. Her actions saved 6 lives, including 3 children. She sustained permanent damage to both optic nerves. For this, she was awarded the nation's highest military honor. Silence. A silence deeper than anything that had come before. Even the judge's expression faltered. Maya's voice rose not in volume, but in fire. You were told this woman was suspicious because she didn't run, because she didn't scream, because she was calm, because she was blind. But what they didn't tell you is that she was calm because she's been through worse, that she didn't run because she doesn't run, and that she's blind because she chose to save lives instead of her own. She paused, scanning the faces before her. No one asked who she was. They only assumed what she looked like, and they were wrong. Her words settled into the bones of every person in that room. And then, for the first time since the trial began, Rebecca stood up, slowly, quietly, her hands pressed to the table, her posture proud. She didn't need the court's permission. She didn't wait to be asked. She turned toward the judge, then toward the jury, and finally toward the rows of journalists whose cameras were still clicking like gunfire. Her voice, when it came, was soft but cut through the room like a blade. I don't need your sympathy, she said. I need your justice. No theatrics, no tears, just truth, raw, brutal, undeniable. I didn't tell you who I was, she continued, because I knew it wouldn't matter. Not to people who already made up their minds. I've been blind for 5 years, but I've seen more clearly than most of you ever will. She took a breath, steady and full. You put a uniform on me, gave me medals, called me a hero. But the moment I didn't fit your picture of innocence, you erased all of that. You made me a suspect, not because of what I did, but because I was easy to blame. Her jaw clenched. And I let it happen. I stayed quiet. I let you bury me under your lies. But no more. The gallery was motionless. Even the prosecution sat frozen papers untouched, eyes lowered. Rebecca's words hit harder than anything Maya could have said, because they came from the one voice no one had bothered to hear. The judge, visibly shaken, adjusted his robe, but didn't interrupt. No one dared. I saved lives, Rebecca said. And when I came home, I lost mine. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept her spine straight. I have one request now, one demand. Don't give me back what you took. Just stop taking from others like me. She sat down slowly. The room stayed frozen. Even the air seemed still. Maya placed a final document on the evidence table. Your Honor, I respectfully move that this court dismiss all charges against Rebecca Lawson and order an immediate review of Officer Reynolds' conduct, including witness tampering, fabrication of evidence, and obstruction of justice. The judge didn't respond immediately. He stared at Rebecca no longer through her, but at her. Really looking. Maybe for the first time, he nodded once. This court will recess for deliberation. The gavel struck, but no one moved, because justice, long delayed, was finally breaking through the cracks. And now, after months of injustice, isolation, and buried truths, it was time for the verdict. The moment the world would decide whether to correct its wrong or double down on its failure. The courtroom was silent, too silent. Kind of silence that only exists when the world holds its breath. Jurors sat with pale faces and tight throats, the weight of truth pressing down on them like a storm cloud ready to burst. The judge returned, his robe swaying with each solemn step, his eyes dark, unreadable. Everyone sat up straighter. Rebecca Lawson, dressed in the same simple clothes she'd worn for months behind bars, gripped the table before her, not out of fear, but resolve. Her hands were steady now, her head high. For once, she didn't feel like the room was watching a suspect. They were watching a reckoning. The judge cleared his throat. Will the defendant please rise? Rebecca stood, slowly, calmly. Every movement was deliberate. The foreman of the jury unfolded a slip of paper with trembling fingers. He looked up, locking eyes with the judge, then shifted to Rebecca. We, the jury, Find the defendant, Rebecca Lawson, not guilty on all counts. The words detonated like thunder. Gas echoed across the gallery. Reporters scrambled, pens flying, fingers on shutters. Maya closed her eyes for a second, as if to let the moment land, then placed a hand over her heart. Rebecca didn't move. She stood still, her expression unreadable. But deep in her chest, a locked door had just burst open. The judge raised his gavel. This court finds all charges dismissed. Furthermore, due to the overwhelming evidence of misconduct, this court is ordering an immediate criminal investigation into Lieutenant Carter Reynolds for witness tampering, coercion, and fabrication of evidence. Now it was Carter who stood frozen, the same man who had once barked orders, who had dragged Rebecca from the street in front of flashing lights and shouts of guilt now stared ahead, jaw tight, color drained from his face. He didn't protest. He didn't blink, because he knew it was over. Two court officers approached him from behind. One gently removed the badge from his chest. The sound of metal sliding off fabric was sharper than any scream. For a second, the room was completely still. Then the murmurs started. A courtroom that had once stared at Rebecca like a criminal now whispered her name with awe, curiosity, and shame. But she didn't revel in it, because this wasn't a victory parade. It was a survival march. As she walked out of the courtroom, cameras exploded like fireworks. Dozens of reporters shouted questions, flashing lights filled the air like machine gun bursts. But Rebecca kept moving. Her shoulders didn't sag. But Rebecca kept moving. Her shoulders didn't sag. Her stride didn't falter. She didn't cover her face. She didn't flinch. Because for the first time in months, she walked not as an inmate, not as a defendant, not even as a symbol. She walked as herself, Rebecca Lawson, soldier, survivor, truth teller. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, a small crowd had gathered, people who had followed the story, people who had doubted her, people who now stared at her like they were seeing something they didn't think existed anymore, a miracle born from injustice. Behind her, a scuffle of movement. Carter Reynolds was being escorted through the hallway, still in uniform, though no longer carrying the weight of power, just the burden of consequence. His face was tight with resentment. He passed by Rebecca, flanked by two internal affairs officers. He didn't look at her, but she turned, just slightly. Her voice, soft but clear, reached him like a blade sliding between armor. Don't let this happen to someone else. No rage, no vengeance, just truth. And that was enough to make him stop in his tracks. He looked at her finally, and for the first time, saw her not as a target, but as the person he tried to erase. She held his gaze for only a moment longer before turning away, leaving him to choke on the silence of his own collapse. Outside, Maya caught up to her. Her voice cracked with pride. You did it. Rebecca shook her head slightly. We did it. But even as the cameras rolled and headlines formed, Rebecca knew that this wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of a warning. She had survived the machine of injustice. She had walked through fire and darkness, alone, unseen, and unheard. But she came out the other side still standing. They hadn't broken her. They had only revealed how unbreakable she already was. No press conference followed, no speeches. Rebecca didn't need to say anything more. She had said the only thing that mattered. Don't let this happen to someone else. And that was enough to echo through every hallway of power, every precinct, every courtroom that had ever turned a blind eye to truth. Rebecca Lawson walked away, not as a victim in chains, but as a woman who had shattered the walls built to bury her. She didn't win because they gave her justice. She won because she never stopped demanding it. This wasn't just a story about a trial. It was a war waged in silence, in shadows, in courtrooms where assumptions speak louder than facts and where truth bleeds slowly, if at all. Rebecca Lawson's name will be remembered not because she fought a legal battle and won, but because she never should have had to fight it in the first place. Her story is a brutal reminder that justice in its purest form doesn't always arrive when it should. Sometimes it arrives too late, and only after the innocent have been broken, bruised, and dragged through hell. What happened to Rebecca was not a mistake. It was a system working exactly the way it was designed to against people like her. A black woman, a disabled veteran, a faceless figure, easy to misjudge, easy to discard, easy to blame. She was arrested not because of evidence, but because she didn't move the way they expected. She didn't react the way they wanted. She didn't fit their image of innocence. She was calm, composed, blind, and for that she was deemed dangerous. They didn't see the years she served in silence. They didn't see the bombs she defused to save innocent lives. They didn't see the darkness she walks through every day without complaint. Number, they saw what they wanted to see: a suspect, a scapegoat, someone to point at, someone to cage, someone to forget. And that is the sickness buried deep in the bones of our so-called justice system. But this story isn't only about the cruelty she endured. It's about what she refused to become. They wanted her to break. She stood. They wanted her to stay quiet. She spoke. They wanted her to disappear. She made them see her. Rebecca didn't walk out of that courtroom because the system saved her. She walked out because she forced it to face itself. The lesson here is not about one heroic lawyer or one courageous woman. It's about how easily a society can vilify the innocent, how quickly fear, bias, and silence can drown the truth if no one is willing to fight for it. It's about the dangerous comfort of assumptions, how quickly a courtroom becomes a stage, how easily evidence is twisted or erased, how deeply injustice hides behind the language of law. We watched as a decorated soldier who gave her sight to save others was accused of theft she couldn't even witness. We watched the system punish her for being blind rather than thank her for seeing the danger others ran from. We watched officers fabricate evidence, manipulate testimony, and stack the odds so high that the only logical outcome was conviction. And we watched her rise anyway. She didn't need to scream. She didn't need vengeance. All she needed was the world to listen. And when it finally did, when the evidence was undeniable and the truth stood naked in the middle of that courtroom, justice had no choice but to follow. But not everyone gets a Maya Ellis. Not every wrongly accused has someone to dig, to fight, to believe. So what then? That's the real question. Because if Rebecca's story ends with applause and headlines, but the system remains unchanged, then all we've done is watch another tragedy with a happy ending and walked away unchanged. We cannot let that happen. Rebecca Lawson's story is a warning. Justice is fragile. Truth can be buried. And power, when left unchecked, will always protect itself first. So remember her not just as a survivor, not just as a hero, but as a symbol of what's possible when one woman stands up against an entire machine and says, "No, not me, not again." She didn't walk out for applause. She walked out for those still trapped, still voiceless, still unseen. And her message, quiet but unshakable, remains burned into the heart of that courtroom and into ours. Don't let this happen to someone else. If you believe that justice is worth fighting for, share Rebecca's story. Let her voice echo beyond the courtroom and into every heart that still dares to hope. Her journey is not just hers, it's a reminder of the silent battles many face every day. Like, subscribe, and stay with us as we continue to tell powerful, emotional stories that demand to be heard. Together, we can shine a light where darkness once ruled. Justice starts with awareness, and awareness begins with you.